Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Cathedral of St. John Burtman and our series, Voices of the Church. Happy to see you here this morning. Happy to see those of you that are joining us online via Facebook Live. These videos are also being archived for later use. We have other groups and parishes that are joining us either right now or later, or using these as part of their own faith formation programming. So today we're going to continue the series by looking at a figure who is considered the second of the Apostolic Fathers. We're going to be exploring the life and writings today of a really remarkable man who became the third bishop of Antioch. If you count St. Peter as the first, he is the third bishop of Antioch in approximately the year 60. And so very early, he was elevated to that see, to that bishopric by St. Peter himself. And again, as I said, he is counted third in the line. It is St. Peter, St. Evodius, and then the man we're going to talk about today, St. Ignatius of Antioch. That is the standard accepted order. And can you imagine having both St. Peter and St. John present at your consecration as Bishop of Antioch? What a remarkable story that is. As St. John Chrysostom reported in the 4th century, and I'm quoting, he received his office at the hands of the apostles themselves. So that itself is a really remarkable story. So revered is his place and his memory as a successor to the apostles, that every single patriarch of Antioch, every bishop of Antioch, since the Middle Ages, has taken the honorary name of Ignatius in his honor. The ancient apostolic see we're going to talk about today that he is associated with, Antioch in Asia Minor, today of course modern-day Turkey. It is ancient. It was founded, the city itself was founded in the 4th century of BC. We know, for instance, that during the late Roman Republic of the 1st century BC, men like Julius Caesar visited there. They extended Roman influence, if not direct Roman control. By the time of the Roman Empire, we find that it is, of course, nominally considered part of the empire. And it was here in Antioch that followers of the way were first called Christians. That is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. Remember that word Christian in Greek means little Christ. And it was intended to be a slur. But the name, of course, was adopted by this movement of the way. And that first happened in Antioch. Wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. Those words written by St. Ignatius of Antioch at the turn of the 2nd century represent the very first time, that phrase represents the very first time that we find that word. In the Greek, it is katos holos. The very first time we find that reference to the church as being Catholic, meaning universal. In the Greek, the words mean according to the whole body. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the significance of that a little bit later this morning. So returning to our vocabulary that we talked about last week, let's do that real quickly. Let's remember that the reason that the first three men we talk about in this series, St. Clement of Rome last week, St. Ignatius of Antioch today, St. Polycarp of Smyrna next week, they hold the special designation, remember, of Apostolic Fathers for a very specific reason. They knew the apostles, they succeeded them in their apostolic ministry, and they are indeed the very bridge into the first generation Christian church. They carry forward the apostolic teaching. So after St. Clement of Rome, St. Ignatius is our second one, and as I said, next week we will look at the last of the Apostolic Fathers, St. Polycarp of Smyrna. Again, I want to emphasize a little bit more, touching upon, this is kind of a review maybe from last week, but touching upon something that I introduced the series with, and I want to go back and say this again, because I think that we miss the whole significance of their role if we gloss over this, that the apostolic teaching was the authority. It was the authority in this early church. There was no canon of Scripture yet. The Bible as we know it did not exist. It's actually centuries, almost 3 centuries away from being finalized. as a canon fully agreed upon. At the time of the lives of these apostolic fathers, sacred scripture existed in the form of letters that were being circulated throughout churches, local church communities. And in fact, these men of the earliest church were instrumental in exercising their authority to even suggest, not suggest, perhaps more advise or demand, that which letters were actually fit to be read in churches, which ones were acceptable to be read. So they therefore shaped, in many ways, the early days, they shaped what would become our biblical canon, because they are the ones who have the authority to say, don't read this one, read this one. We know that there were literally dozens, for instance, of Gospels that were in circulation by the 2nd century. And so which ones of those could be read in churches and which ones were deemed to be perhaps more spurious or not exactly authentic, or their authorship could not be verified. So the point is, and I don't think that we can make this point too much or too strongly, is that there is an authority at work in this very early church that is external to Scripture, that both precedes and attests to the Scriptures. And I think that we can't lose that perspective if we want to really remember and explore the significance of this first generation church, this bridge into the first generation church. All three of the apostolic fathers are martyrs. The image you see here is a rather brutal one from the 17th century that depicts the martyrdom of St. Ignatius of Antioch. Tradition holds that he was fed to the lions in Rome as spectacle entertainment during the reign of the Emperor Trajan. So it's a rather gruesome story that we're going to explore a little bit today. Not too much over breakfast time, but we will explore it a little bit, because you see, his martyrdom likely, perhaps, had witnesses that testified to what they saw on this day in Rome. Although that report, the martyrium as it's called, is not without controversy. That's going to be something that you're going to find as a theme, particularly among these early texts, is that beginning really in the 18th and 19th centuries in the West, there is a sort of a general deconstruction of a lot of earlier texts, a lot of questioning of what was always held to be sort of canonical and authoritative. And so, like many other of these ancient texts, including the Bible itself, by the way, this particular work is not without controversy. There's some suggestion that it was not authentic. So we'll talk about that, something we're going to unpack again a little bit later. So a lot of sources differ about the year of his martyrdom. But for our purposes this morning, we're going to go with the year 108. And I'll tell you why I'm going with the year 108. This coincides with the date, the recounting that is given by the historian Eusebius. Right, Eusebius of Caesarea, who gives us that date. And Eusebius of Caesarea, for those of you here at the cathedral, you've heard me talk about him a lot. He is a go-to early source for those first centuries of Christianity. For those who don't know, he was the historian to the Emperor Constantine. And he wrote a work called A History of the Church from Christ to Constantine. This generally considered a good general source to begin with. It is, in many cases, what he cannot substantiate from a primary source, he relates as tradition of the church, a strong tradition sometimes of the church. Our other major sources for the life of St. Ignatius of Antioch are St. Jerome. I know there's a big surprise there, right? St. Jerome, who also, you'll be hearing me reference his work a lot. In his work, De Viris Illustribus, or Illustrious Men, as he calls it, he actually wrote this in a cave in Bethlehem in the late 4th century, where he recounts the lives of, I think, 130 plus figures of the early church. Everything that he has heard from tradition, everything that has been told to him with authority about the lives of men. And St. Ignatius of Antioch is one of the very first, of course, that he deals with in that text. Another great doctor, one we'll be talking about later, and one of the Greek doctors is St. John Chrysostom, and he also recounts the life of St. Ignatius of Antioch. So it's from all three of them that we get what is considered also a definitive list of the writings of St. Ignatius of Antioch. 7 letters in all, although there are 9 others that appear by the time of the Middle Ages that are not necessarily considered authentic by many scholars, by the way. But there are 7 that are considered to be definitive, authentic writings that he wrote, interestingly, while on the way from Antioch to Rome to face his martyrdom. There is no question that St. Ignatius of Antioch faced a horrific way to die. There's no question. And it was in some measure, apparently, if you read, there's a few of his letters, one in particular, one that's not in your reader, but the letter to the Romans where he mentions this. This is something that he wanted, something that he desired, a martyr's death. So, what we're going to do is look at his life and then his quite influential writings. And if nothing else, I hope today that you can take away a sense of his importance in the early church and shaping not only early theology of the church, but also, it's a big word, ecclesiology. Now that comes from the Greek word ecclesia, which means church. So ecclesiology is the study of all things that are church related. We're talking about structure and governance and hierarchy. And this is perhaps one of his most significant contributions to us today, even, for those of us who are historians of the church, is he gives us a direct snapshot of what that late 1st, early 2nd century church looked like in terms of structure, in terms of its governance. And that, again, that and also he gives us the very beginnings of a theology of martyrdom that many of the great thinkers of Christianity will carry forward into the future. So, the life of St. Ignatius of Antioch. He was born in the region of Ephesus, which is probably how he came to know the Apostle John, we think. But very little is known of his early life, and sources don't really agree on the date of his birth. Some place it as early as the year 30. Some say more toward 35 or 36, but we're in that window that may overlap with the end of the public ministry of Jesus or the very beginning of the apostolic age for sure. And if we go through his martyrdom in 108, which I think we can go with that date for sure. But while we're on that topic, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. There is a really interesting legend about St. Ignatius that appears in more than a few early sources. And I want to stress to you that this is, I say we have to call it legend and not, if it is tradition, it is very, very minor tradition. But the reason being we don't know the date of his birth. We really can't substantiate this or what he would have been doing outside of the area of his birth at the time this story supposedly took place. But I want to tell it to you anyway because it's a great story, and if it's not true, it's still a great story. So let's look at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. The context here is that this is just following the Transfiguration, and Jesus is traveling with his apostles through Galilee, and this is what the evangelist St. Mark tells us. Quote, "They came to Capernaum, and there they were in the house, and he asked them, 'What was the dispute you were having on the way?' They said nothing, for they had been disputing among themselves which should be the greatest of them," the apostles, right? "Then he sat down and called the 12 to him and said, 'If anyone has a mind to be the greatest, he must be the last of all and the servant of all.' And he took a little child and gave it a place in the midst of them, and he took the child in his arms and said to them, 'Whoever welcomes such a child as this in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but him who sent me.'" Everybody kind of familiar with that? You've heard that gospel narrative? The early legend is that St. Ignatius was that child. It is described in the Gospel of Mark. The origin of the story is obscure to us. I couldn't tell you where it came from. The identification of the child as St. Ignatius is something that was apparently picked up very early in the church. But again, it's a persistent tale that is associated with him from the early centuries. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. Again, we don't even know the year of his birth. We have established that he knew both St. Peter and St. John, attested to by numerous sources, and he was also a good friend of St. Polycarp of Smyrna. As a matter of fact, one of the 7 letters to be authenticated to his authorship was written to Polycarp in Smyrna while he was on his way to Rome to be martyred. St. Polycarp of Smyrna was also a disciple of the Apostle John. So it may be that's how they came to know each other. So our context today is the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. This was pretty much the order of the day at the end of the first century. First under, of course, really beginning in earnest under the Emperor Nero in the 50s and 60s, you begin to see persecutions, wave after wave of persecution, that culminated, of course, in the martyrdoms of both St. Peter and St. Paul in the city of Rome about the year 64. And then we have the Jewish wars, the Jewish revolts, that culminate by the year 70. And there is another wave of Roman response against Christians in general, because of their association with Judaism. There's sort of a backlash against the group then. But something everyone knows, I mean, the reason that Christians are particularly singled out for persecution at the hands of Roman authorities is because Christianity is exclusivist. Right? Christians are not willing to accept the gods of others. And this was considered, quite honestly, a little bit subversive and suspicious for Roman authorities, and also poor civic behavior. Social cohesion demands that everybody sort of be on the same page religiously. It's how you maintain order in the empire. And so that's kind of the background for this, is that there was a new wave of persecutions that broke out under the reign of the Emperor Domitian at the end of the first century. And then we usher in the reign of the Emperor Trajan, who renews this effort. And in particular, he was, I think it speaks to the lively, dynamic community of Christians who were in Antioch, that this became a focal point for Trajan's persecutions, is that he does sort of zoom in on Antioch. So St. Ignatius encouraged his followers during this time of persecution and remained apparently quite steadfast in his leadership. What we know of his martyrdom comes from the sources I have mentioned, and also, as I mentioned, the Eusebius, St. Jerome, and St. John Chrysostom. But there's also this work I referenced very briefly earlier called the Martyrium, or the Martyrdom of Ignatius, which is, as I said, somewhat controversial in its dating, but it purports to be an eyewitness account. It reads as an eyewitness account. Several eyewitnesses, in fact, seem to have contributed to this. It's not just the viewpoint of one person. Not just to the actual martyrdom in Rome, but to the events that led up to it. The scholars of this early period, as I said, are divided. So I always want to qualify when I introduce a text that's not unanimous agreement about. I always want to introduce to you that, you can use an index of suspicion if you'd like. I think that it's healthy to do that when there's not a general consensus about the authenticity of it. But regardless, we know that it existed. The oldest copy of it we have dates to the 11th century. So certainly by the High Middle Ages, there is this great story in circulation that purports to be an eyewitness to his martyrdom. And let's talk about what that says, because the text gives us a time framework. And it's actually, interestingly, the time framework that Eusebius used in the 4th century. This witness says that the persecutions began anew during the 9th year of the reign of the Emperor Trajan, which would mean the year 107. So the date often given of 108 that all three of the sources I referenced agree upon is plausible, to us. The work also relates that Trajan had decreed in Antioch that all must join in the worship of pagan gods. As a matter of fact, from this account, one gets the sense that Trajan made a special visit to the city of Antioch to issue this decree that all must join in the worship of the Roman gods. And that St. Ignatius was arrested. Ironically, the charge against him, does anybody know what the charge against him would have been officially for the Romans? He was charged with atheism. It's atheism, for refusing to accept the Roman gods. So his crime was his refusal for that, and also the fact that he was preaching against the Roman gods and inciting others to reject the Roman gods. So this account relates that St. Ignatius was brought for trial before the emperor himself. I think this is part of it that might be a little bit of a stretch for some historians of the ancient world, but that he was brought before the emperor himself, who, as I said, was in Antioch at the time, and the emperor sentenced him to death in the arena in Rome. Now this meant that he would have to be transported, you see, from Antioch to Rome. And the reason for this, given, is that the emperor intended to make a spectacle out of him in the capital city of the empire. And really, by the way, this was to take place in the Flavian Amphitheater, which the work had begun a few decades before, in the 70s, I believe. The Flavian Amphitheater, which we know today better as the Colosseum. That is where this was to take place. So, I think, again, it speaks to, if indeed this account is true, this martyrium that we have, if that is true, then what it tells us is that St. Ignatius was of such stature in the Christian community and known so well and was seen as potentially such a threat that not only did the emperor call him before himself, but that he wanted him to be executed in the city of Rome and not locally. So let's make a real example out of him in the capital city itself. So on his journey from Antioch to Rome, he wrote 7 letters, which other fathers and doctors attest to from antiquity. Eusebius gives us this complete list, by the way, in the 4th century. These 7 letters constitute writings of such depth and such importance in the early faith that some of the early bishops seem to have considered them for the canon of Scripture. There seems to have been some talk of the way that they were circulating in the early church, that they had such authority. From these letters, there can be no question that he desired martyrdom. He even went as far as to ask that no one do anything that would impede it, to make no attempt to rescue him, that he even hoped that the beast would devour all of his remains so that there would be little to clean up, so to speak. I'm saying that politely. In his letter to the Christians at Rome, this is what he writes about that. I'm going to quote him. I pray the wild beast will be found ready for me. Indeed, I will coax them to devour me quickly, and even if they do not wish to do so willingly, I will somehow force them to do that. Fire and cross and packs of wild beasts, cuttings and being torn apart, scattering of my bones, the mangling of my limbs, the grinding of my whole body, the evil torments of the devil, let them come upon me, so that I may attain to Jesus Christ. Now, there were some remains that, according to the rather graphic nature of this account I mentioned to you, the martyrium, and a deacon from Antioch, according to that account, there was a deacon from Antioch who retrieved them and returned them to that city, where they remained until the 7th century. Then we have a record of the translation of the remains of St. Ignatius from Antioch to Rome, to the Church of St. Clement that we talked about last week, that first martyr of the Apostolic Fathers. The Church of San Clemente in Rome is where those remains of St. Ignatius also rest today. Because of his significance as an Apostolic Father, small portions of his relics have been shared throughout the centuries. And his relics, again, along with those of St. Clement of Rome, are among those that are specifically mentioned in the records of the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. That council dealt with many issues that were threatening relations between Eastern and Western Christians, and one of those issues related to the veneration of relics. So there is sort of an inventory that appears in part of those records, and the relics of St. Ignatius are mentioned there. So next week we're going to be talking about the first full account of a martyrdom that is authentic, and the first full account of the veneration of relics by early Christians when we examine St. Polycarp. Really interesting history that begins the beautiful practice of something in our faith that I think some people misunderstand, particularly those outside of our faith. But we're going to have an opportunity to talk about the veneration of relics from a theological perspective, and that first full account that we get from the martyrdom of Polycarp. And just so you know, those of you at the cathedral would like to know this, there is a first-class relic of St. Ignatius of Antioch in our reliquary, in the transept of the cathedral. It's in a silver oval reliquary that is hanging on a shelf. So go by for a few minutes and take a look and venerate that. He is in a small, small reliquary with several other martyrs of the church. Now to those writings. The 7 letters that he wrote were to the Christians of 5 early churches in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. He also wrote a letter to the church in Rome, and he wrote a letter to his friend Polycarp. These writings, again, constitute some of the richest Christian literature outside of sacred scripture, and importantly, he speaks with the authority that he received from 2 apostles, St. Peter and St. John. He is speaking with their authority, both of whom he knew well. He opens 2 of the letters by telling the reader he is addressed as are known as Theophilus, a name which means God-bearer. You'll often see him referred to that way in biographies of his life. Interestingly, he was the first Christian writer outside of the New Testament to write of the virgin birth. In 3 of these 7 letters, he writes of the incarnation in a way, he uses language that sounds very familiar to us today, for both the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed that come much later. He's speaking in that creedal language already to describe the incarnation. From the opening of his letter to Smyrna, he says, quote, "He," that is Christ, "is truly from the family of David, according to the flesh, Son of God, according to the will and power of God, truly born of a virgin, baptized by John, that all righteousness might be fulfilled by him. In the time of Pontius Pilate and the Tetrarch Herod, he was truly nailed for us in the flesh, so that through his resurrection he might eternally lift up the standard of his holy and faithful ones." So he writes of the incarnation in a way that prefigures what will become the creedal language of later fathers. More than one commentator actually has observed that the word that he uses in the Greek, truly, aleithos, is the word he uses over and over and over again. Truly, truly he was flesh, truly he was nailed, truly it was a virgin birth. That word in the Greek connotes an emphatic, sort of an emphatic, almost demanding kind of tone. That no, this is true. This is absolutely true, what he's saying. So is he countering perhaps some early Gnostic heresies that might already be circulating about the person and nature of Jesus Christ, or is he just that emphatic that no, I received this with authority. This is true. He is testifying to what he knows to be true, and his narrative about everything, theology, and those issues of ecclesiology I mentioned, all take on greater meaning, I think, when we keep in mind who he heard and learned from. That takes on, I think, all the more significance for us. And while I certainly encourage you to read all of his letters, if you'd like, the one included in the reader, his letter to the Christians in Smyrna, gives us important insights into into that ecclesiology, his view of the authority and structure of the early church. And I chose it more for that precisely than for its theological connotations. I chose it because it's the one that church historians look at and say, look, here is the governance of the early church. It's laid out for us in very plain language. One primary point about the letter is that it recorded the very early development and already established concept of hierarchy in the church. Or listen to what he wrote. Quote, "Follow all of you the bishop, as Jesus Christ followed the Father. Wherever the bishop appears, let the people be. Even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church." You see, there's the context for that phrase. "It is not lawful, apart from the bishop, either to baptize or hold the Eucharist." He continued he continues this in this letter to the Christians there in Smyrna. This is, of course, also remarkable because it is the first recorded use of the word Catholic to describe the church, meaning universal. And obviously, when he's writing, let's say the year 108, the full hierarchy as we know it did not yet exist, but the word he uses in the Greek for bishop is episkopos. It's that same word that appears 5 times in the New Testament. It is, of course, where our word episcopal comes from, which refers to the office of bishop. So you find a similar theme in his letter to the church in Magnesia. He says something very similar. "Take care to do all things in harmony with the bishop presiding in the place of God, and with the presbyters in the place of the deacons and apostles." He goes on to list other church offices. He uses the word presbyters, again, in a way that probably doesn't reflect our understanding of the priesthood as we know it today. But what's key here is that he outlines the authority of the bishop as a successor to the apostles. So at the time of the writing, as I said, what we see is that the bishop is constitutive of the church itself. There's no valid baptism or Eucharist that can be performed in his absence. So, I think hugely important. St. Ignatius gives us this snapshot of the structure of the church, but also that the office of bishop is very well established by this point in time. And therein lies part of its great significance to us today. I would mention, too, that he writes of suffering in a way that is profoundly theological and in no doubt shapes future Christian thought about suffering. He says, "I endure all things in order to suffer with Christ." So the way he begins that uniting his suffering to Christ, I think we can take away a very interesting glimpse into the early theology of this. Remember that for early Christians during times of persecution, martyrdom was the narrow gate. It was desired. That was the ultimate fulfillment of your Christian life, was to be a martyr. And so he uses the strongest possible participatory language. That might be the way to say it. Participatory language, a mystical way of thinking of union with Christ as being suffering. To suffer a brutal physical death, so that Christ's own brutal death is ever more glorified. So, to summarize the reasons that I think that this particular letter, the church to the Christians in Smyrna, the reasons I think this particular letter is still significant for us to study today. First of all, its language clearly prefigures the later creedal statements of Christianity. You can almost trace the influence of that to St. Ignatius of Antioch. From the standpoint of biblical scholarship, his letters quote 2 of the Gospels directly. And again, as we mentioned last week, talking about St. Clement of Rome, he doesn't mention the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, chapter and verse, because remember, we don't have that yet. But he quotes them, and he doesn't even identify, in the quote, he doesn't even identify that the author is an evangelist, right? But he quotes them in a way that is direct. We know where they came from. He also quotes the Acts of the Apostles. And what does this do? Outside of telling us that St. Ignatius is speaking with authority on the Scriptures, it actually attests to the historicity of those Scriptures. Do you see? That he's quoting them. He's quoting them in the year 108. They were obviously well in circulation by that point in time. There can be no question that he is quoting something that he knows well. I think the third thing is he gives us an accounting of that early ecclesiology, as I mentioned, the structure of the church. The fourth thing is the role of the bishop as constitutive of the church itself. The fact that baptism and the Eucharist are obviously sacraments that cannot be validly performed in the absence of the bishop. And then 5, I think that theology of martyrdom that I referenced, meaning to suffer with Christ, that would define the narrow gate for Christians during the times of the greatest persecutions, which, believe it or not, are still in the future for Christians. In the year 108, they haven't seen the worst of it yet. And this lays a theological foundation of hope, really, for the generations that are coming. So for continuity, I want to link some things together. Last week, we saw that St. Clement of Rome addressed the issue of clergy and laity in relationship in the early church. St. Ignatius of Antioch, therefore, sort of expands this further in his description of the Eucharist as, quote, flesh of Christ, and its validity only with the bishop present, that these are principles of Christian unity in this structure that he outlines based on the foundation that St. Clement gave us last week. And not too far in the future, like 7 days from now, for us, next week, not too far in the future, by the time of St. Polycarp's martyrdom in the year 155, there is a description of the Roman Mass in circulation because of a man named St. Justin Martyr that is circulating about the year 155 that would be completely recognizable to any Catholic today. Okay? So, this, you see, is the importance of the Fathers. This is the significance of the Fathers. As for St. Ignatius of Antioch, his letters, I think, continue to provoke a lot of study and contemplation among us. I think you've sort of gotten a sense of that this morning, that there is much here to be mined, to be gleaned from his letters, just the one we've really talked about. Their authorship, I want to go back and say this, their authorship is not in doubt among the consensus of scholars, although the question of their authenticity has raised its head a few times, beginning the first time with the onset of the Protestant movement in the 16th century. You see the first time they're ever questioned in 16th century, 15th centuries essentially, almost 15 centuries, is the first time you ever see a question raised about the authenticity of these letters. And it was John Calvin who questioned it and actually had some not very kind things to say about them, essentially calling them false and fabricated, for the purpose of substantiating the Roman claim to the papacy. So that's the first time you really see it questioned. And then again, as I mentioned, after the 18th, 19th century, and certainly by the time of the postmodern era of the 20th century, all of these major early texts are being deconstructed just for the fun of it, really, just to question everything that was the big stories of the past, has been our trend. But Polycarp made a collection of Ignatius's letters and sent them to the church in Philippi. This seems to not be in question. That is attested to again in the 4th century. The collection was all 7 of these letters that Eusebius of Caesarea lists. In particular, I think this is important too, for anyone who would ever want to question the authorship, to remember that Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, a doctor of the church, not one of the ones we're going to talk about, but he is late 2nd, early 3rd century. Okay, so he died in the year 202. He's the Bishop of Lyon. And he's writing in that late 2nd century, the 190s. late 2nd century, the 190s. He's writing and quoting, he quotes the letter that St. Ignatius wrote to the Romans, and he quotes it directly. Okay? So if for no other reason, the fact that we have an extant reference, a direct quote in another source that we know to be authentic, I really don't think there's any question, and certainly didn't seem to be among those early sources of Eusebius, St. Jerome, and St. John Chrysostom. All believed them authentic. So if they are accepted as authentic, then the veracity of his testimony is not in question, nor the conditions of the early church that he records. They are true, providing us, I think, with a direct link to the Church of the Apostles, or that immediate first generation church. So next week what we will do is we will transition to look at the last of these figures of the apostolic fathers, another disciple of the Apostle John. Next week we'll turn our attention to St. Polycarp of Smyrna. So I'm going to stay with you guys for a few minutes. I hope that you've got some questions you might want to ask or want to have a conversation. But I'm going to end the formal presentation here, and we will resume next week. All right? And thank you for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who's out there watching now or watching later. Thanks for joining us.